November 12th, 2003. The storm had passed only an hour earlier, leaving the land around Willow Creek in a muffled silence. Snow clung stubbornly to the fence posts, bending them like weary sentinels, and the sky above was a dull sheet of pewter. The windmill beside the sagging farmhouse turned just enough to let out an occasional groan, a sound that seemed too human for metal. The smell of damp earth and the faint tang of wood smoke hung in the air, as though the place itself had been exhaling for the first time in months. Sheriff's Deputy Daniel Mercer stepped out of the patrol truck, boots sinking with a wet crunch into the half-frozen ground. He glanced at his partner, Deputy Foster, who was still scribbling notes in the front seat. The anonymous call had been vague children living in dangerous conditions, but the voice had carried urgency, the kind that made dispatch send them out despite the storm. The house stood about 30 yards ahead, 2 stories that seemed to lean slightly east, as if tired of holding its own weight. Its windows were streaked with frost from the inside, the glass so dirty that only shadows moved behind them. Beside it, a barn had collapsed inward years ago, the skeletal beams jutting upward like the ribs of a carcass. The front door opened before they could knock. 2 men stepped out onto the porch, their movements slow and oddly in sync. Both were thin to the point of frailty, their skin so pale it seemed almost translucent under the winter light. They wore mismatched clothing layers of sweaters and worn coats, but what caught Mercer's attention were their faces. At first glance, they could have been twins. The same narrow jawline, the same eyes set a fraction too close together, the same small, tight-lipped mouth. Yet there was an uncanny imbalance to them, as though a single face had been molded twice, but never quite finished either time. Their hair was fine and unkempt, a pale brown that hung limp over their ears. "Afternoon," Mercer began, keeping his voice even. "We got a call from someone concerned about folks living here. You, the Johnsons." The taller one nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The shorter one kept his gaze fixed on Mercer's boots. Neither spoke. Mercer tried again. "Anyone else inside? Kids your parents?" A long pause. The taller man's lips moved, but the sound that came out was faint, like a rustle. "No, just us." His voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in days or years. Deputy Foster stepped up onto the porch, eyes scanning the yard. "You boys mind if we take a look around, just to make sure everything's all right?" The shorter brother finally lifted his head. His pupils were small in the dim light, and his expression was unreadable. After another moment's pause, he gave a slow, stiff nod. Inside. The air was heavy with the scent of kerosene and mildew. The living room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp on a side table. Worn furniture was pushed close to the stove, where a faint heat radiated. Mercer noticed that the curtains had been nailed to the window frames. No daylight could enter unless deliberately torn away. His boots creaked against the wooden floor as he moved further in. Dust motes drifted in the lamplight, and the wallpaper yellowed with age peeled in long strips, revealing the gray boards beneath. On the far wall, a cluster of framed photographs hung in no particular order. He stepped closer. The photos spanned decades, perhaps more than a century, but in every one, the faces repeated, not just similar, nearly identical. Children, young couples, elders, all sharing the same narrow features, the same deep-set eyes. The progression of time was marked only by changes in clothing and the gradual fade of the prints. Mercer felt the hair on his neck rise. He had seen old family photos before, but never this. It was like looking at one person, lived and relived across generations. "Dan," Foster called quietly from the kitchen doorway. "You're going to want to see this." Mercer followed him into the narrow kitchen. A single bare bulb buzzed faintly overhead. The table was bare except for a loaf of bread, hard as stone, and a jar of something cloudy. On the counter sat a row of glass jars, each labeled in faded handwriting, summer 1989, winter 1994, fall 1997, all filled with preserved vegetables, some floating in brine that had long since darkened. But what caught his eye wasn't the food. Against the far wall was a door, small, only about 4 feet high, the kind of door that led to a crawlspace or storage area. Its surface was scarred with scratches, some shallow, others deep. Mercer crouched and touched the wood. It was cold, damp. He pressed his ear to it, nothing. He glanced back at the brothers, who now stood in the kitchen doorway, watching silently. The taller one's lips pressed into a thin line. The shorter one's gaze darted to the door and back to Mercer. "We'll need to come back with social services." Foster said under his breath, "Something's not right here." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. Snowflakes drifted in the gray air. The brothers didn't move from the doorway, didn't ask questions, didn't protest. They only stood, side by side, like two figures carved from the same block of stone. Mercer made a note in his field log before they left: 2 adult males, nonverbal tendencies, house in poor condition, possible additional residents. Strong impression this is not just neglect. Something deeper here. What neither deputy realized yet was that their assumption that this was a simple welfare check would soon dissolve entirely, giving way to something far darker, rooted not in poverty or accident, but in a history that had been carefully guarded and deliberately erased. The Johnson name had been on the land for more than a century, long before the county had electricity or proper roads. They had come in the summer of 1892, 3 brothers from rural Sweden, traveling west with little more than a wagon, a few tools, and the conviction that distance from others meant safety. The land they chose lay 15 miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by low, rolling hills that trapped snow in winter and dust in summer. It was, in every practical sense, the end of the road. At first, they were respected. The early Johnson homestead was a model of self-sufficiency: sheep, dairy cows, wheat fields. They built a modest wooden house with wide porches and a sturdy barn. They attended the church in Willow Creek when the weather allowed, and traded pelts and cheese in town. But something began to change within 2 generations. No one could pinpoint when the first cousin marriage took place, but the reason, at least in their telling, was simple mistrust. Outsiders, they said, brought disease and moral rot. As years passed, trips to town grew fewer. Church attendance stopped altogether. The family stopped registering births with the county, claiming they didn't need government meddling. By the 1930s, a strict set of rules governed life on Johnson land, rules not written down, but enforced as rigidly as any law. No one married outside the family. No one traveled beyond the old railroad tracks without permission from the patriarch. Any child who questioned these rules was punished by confinement, sometimes for days, in the root cellar. The world beyond their fence line kept moving forward. But on Johnson land, time hardened like ice. New barns were never built. Old ones simply leaned until they fell. When electricity came to Willow Creek in 1949, the Johnsons refused the connection. "Lamp oil worked for our fathers," one elder told a traveling salesman, "and it'll work for us." With each passing decade, the family tree narrowed. By the late 1960s, births began to outnumber graves less and less. Some infants were buried in the small plot behind the barn before they had been seen by anyone outside the household. Neighbors whispered about children with strangely shaped skulls, bent legs, or eyes that never focused quite right. In 1974, a county health officer named Margaret Doyle visited the property after a rumor reached her desk that the Johnson kids were living in squalor. She later wrote a report describing the house as unfit for human habitation and recommended immediate intervention. The report contained a troubling note: family shows significant signs of genetic homogeneity, high likelihood of congenital conditions. but the report never saw the light of day. Months later, Doyle was transferred to another district, and the original document vanished from county records. The official line was that no action was deemed necessary. By the 1980s, the Johnson household had shrunk to 2 adult siblings. Their spouses also Johnsons by blood and 4 children. The children rarely appeared in public, except for 2 boys seen occasionally at the edge of the property, standing by the fence as if watching for something they didn't quite understand. Those boys, neighbors would later realize, were the same 2 men who stood on the porch that November day in 2003. Their childhood had been one of silence and routine. Sunrise chores, long hours tending animals, evenings by the stove while their parents read aloud from an old Swedish Bible. No television, no schooling beyond what their mother could teach from a tattered primer. Every lesson came with the same refrain: "We are Johnsons. We keep to ourselves. When outsiders drove past, the boys were told to hide. If they disobeyed, they were locked in the cellar for reflection. Over time, their world shrank to the house, the barn, and the surrounding fields. Beyond that was a place spoken of only as the danger. The brothers' parents died in the late 1990s, leaving the 2 young men alone on the land. By then, they had no legal identification, no bank accounts, no history in the eyes of the state. They survived on the preserved food in the pantry, hunting deer in season, and slaughtering the few livestock that remained. The roof began to leak. The barn collapsed. Still, they stayed. It was in this slow decay that the first cracks appeared rumors from the nearest neighbor, nearly a mile away, of shapes moving at night, and lights in the upstairs windows long after midnight. No one knew who placed the anonymous call to the sheriff's office in 2003. Some suspected it was a new mail carrier, unnerved by the silent men who took their parcels without a word. What the deputies did not yet know but would soon learn was that the Johnson brothers were not simply the end of a family line. They were its final product, the living proof of a century's refusal to let new blood in. In the county archives, the 1974 report still existed, but it would take one determined investigator months to find it. And when she did, she would discover that it had been marked for destruction, stamped in red with a single word, erased. 2 days after the first visit, the deputies returned to the Johnson property, this time with a social services officer, a county health inspector, and a warrant to search the premises. The sky was the pale blue of deep winter, the kind that seemed to give off no warmth at all. Frost still clung to the shaded sides of fence posts, and the air smelled faintly of iron, as if the ground itself was frozen metal. The brothers were waiting on the porch again, standing side by side like they had been placed there deliberately. Their expressions were the same, neutral, unreadable. They didn't resist when the officers approached, didn't ask why they were there. Inside, the air was thick with the stale burn of kerosene and something else, a faint, sour undertone that seemed to come from the very walls. The inspector began in the living room, noting the boarded windows, the peeling wallpaper, the visible gaps between floorboards. Mercer lingered by the wall of family photographs. The faces still unnerved him, their sameness so complete it was like seeing a single person aging in uneven stages. In the kitchen, Officer Janice Holloway from Child Welfare carefully opened the small jars lining the counter. Some contents had turned gray, others black. She set them down without comment, eyes drifting toward the small scarred door in the corner. She tried the latch locked. "Where does this go?" she asked, looking to the brothers. The shorter one answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Down. Down," where he didn't respond. Holloway exchanged a look with Mercer, who noted the scratches around the latch again, some fresh, others so deep they had splintered the wood. Upstairs, the inspector found 2 small bedrooms. Both smelled of unwashed fabric and dry dust. One held a narrow bed, its thin mattress sagging in the middle, covered with a quilt that might have been hand-stitched half a century ago. The other room had no bed at all, only a pile of old blankets in one corner, a rusted oil lamp, and a single framed photograph of two children sitting on the same porch, their eyes the exact pale gray as the men downstairs. Mercer flipped through a trunk at the foot of one bed. Inside were letters in neat, looping script, dated between 1931 and 1948. They were addressed between family members, but never to anyone outside the surname Johnson. The contents were unsettling in their plainness, arrangements for marriages between cousins, the births of children noted with short phrases like healthy male, favors mother or girl with weak chest. Tucked beneath the letters was a worn family Bible. Its pages were brittle, but the margins were filled with annotations, names, dates, and pairings. Some were scratched out and rewritten. Mercer turned a page and stopped. Two names, joined by a hand-drawn heart, shared the same surname and the same parents listed just 2 lines above. In the downstairs parlor, Holloway spoke to the brothers again, trying to piece together their history. They gave short, halting answers. No, they'd never been to school. No, they'd never been to a hospital. Yes, their parents had lived here their whole lives. And before them, she asked. The taller brother hesitated, then murmured, "Always here." The turning point came when the health inspector, rummaging through the kitchen pantry, found an old ledger shoved behind a stack of cracked plates. Inside were decades of notes, crop yields, livestock births, and a section in the back titled Bloodline. Each entry detailed who had married whom, how they were related, and whether their children had fared well or faded early. Dr. Alan Whitford, the town's retired physician, was brought in for consultation after hearing of the case. He remembered treating a few Johnson kids in the 1970s and 80s. They came in with odd gait, joint stiffness, he told Mercer. Speech was delayed, and in some cases, never developed fully. I suspected genetic causes, but they stopped coming after a while. Told me they had their own remedies. When Whitford examined the brothers, his notes were blunt, prominent jaw, narrow palate, reduced height for age, likely cognitive impairment, multiple minor congenital anomalies. Findings consistent with severe consanguinity. The evidence was building, but it was still pieces of a puzzle. Mercer wanted the whole picture. That was when he returned to the small door in the kitchen. The warrant gave him the right to open it, and this time, he came with a pry bar. The wood creaked under the strain before the latch snapped free. The smell that escaped was unmistakable stale air thick with ammonia, the sour tang of waste, and the faint mildew of damp earth. A narrow set of wooden steps descended into shadow. Foster turned on his flashlight. The beam fell on a cramped, dirt-floored space. 2 mattresses lay on the ground, their fabric stained and torn. Rusted tin cans were scattered nearby, along with a chipped enamel basin and a single metal bucket. In one corner, barely illuminated, was a crib made from unfinished wood, its bars uneven, as if cut by hand. Mercer's stomach tightened. "This is where they kept them," he said quietly. From the top of the stairs, the shorter brother spoke, almost mechanically. "Safe here, away from the poison." No one responded. The team would leave the property that day with more questions than answers. But the cellar had shifted the investigation. It was no longer about neglect. It was about intent, a deliberate system, carried out for generations, designed to keep the bloodline closed and the world outside locked away. What Mercer didn't yet realize was that the most damning evidence was still hidden in plain sight, waiting for them in a place no one thought to search. The following week, armed with an expanded warrant and a forensic team, Mercer and Holloway returned to the Johnson property. The air had shifted, the storms were gone, replaced by brittle cold that made the wooden steps creak under every footfall. A low sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the bare cottonwoods. their branches rattling like dry bones. The brothers were there again, waiting, but this time their posture had changed. They no longer stood side by side like statues. The taller one fidgeted with the frayed cuff of his sweater. The shorter kept his eyes on the ground. Something in their stillness suggested they knew the intrusion today would cut deeper than before. The team split. Holloway went to photograph the cellar in detail. Mercer began a room-by-room sweep, pulling out furniture, lifting warped floorboards. In the upstairs bedroom, the one without a bed, a forensic tech noticed faint scrape marks on the wall behind the pile of blankets. Pulling them aside revealed a small, crudely concealed door flush with the plaster. The hinges protested as Mercer forced it open. Behind it lay a shallow storage nook, no more than 2 feet deep. Inside, stacked with eerie precision, were 4 shoeboxes wrapped in layers of oilcloth. He carried them downstairs to the kitchen table, where the forensic team began opening them one by one. The first contained faded Polaroids, dozens of them. Children, infants, young adults, all with the same narrow faces and pale eyes. In some photos, they posed stiffly against the farmhouse wall. In others, they sat on the cellar mattresses, their expressions a mix of blankness and quiet resignation. Dates were scribbled on the backs in shaky handwriting, spanning from 1961 to 1998. The second box held notebooks more like ledgers filled with entries written in the same looping hand found in the old trunk letters. Each page recorded a birth, a pairing, or a death. Some entries were blunt stillborn, girl, father is brother. Others were chillingly casual, healthy boy. Strong legs. Will pair with cousin Anna in 3 years. The third box was filled with small objects, children's shoes, hair ribbons, a rusted harmonica. The fourth was the most disturbing medical pamphlets, some dating back to the 1920s, about managing hereditary weakness and the purity of rural families. The language inside was clinical, but the intent was unmistakable. Holloway, emerging from the cellar, was pale. "There's something else," she said. "You should hear it from them." The brothers were seated at the kitchen table, each with a steaming mug of tea Holloway had coaxed them into holding. The shorter one spoke first, his words halting, his breath visible in the cold air. "We were kept safe," he said, "like our parents. And their parents." Mercer asked what safe meant. The taller brother answered, his voice rasping as if pulled from deep in his chest. "Safe from the poison. The world outside makes you sick. Mama said our blood was clean. The cellar was where you stayed until you were ready, until you could be trusted not to go past the fence." They told the story in fragments, how they were born in the upstairs room, never leaving it for the first years of their lives, how they were moved to the cellar during training, learning to care for animals, cook, mend clothes, but always in darkness, always together. They were told that strangers carried diseases in their hands, in their breath, in their eyes, that even a handshake could kill. When Mercer asked about the pairings recorded in the ledgers, the brothers didn't seem to understand the question at first. Then the shorter one shrugged. "That's just how it's done. You marry the ones you know, everyone else isn't real." The forensic DNA analysis came back 3 days later. The results were stark, an inbreeding coefficient exceeding 0.70, genetically closer than parent and child. Multiple deleterious recessive alleles were expressed, explaining the brothers' joint deformities, mild cognitive impairment, and speech irregularities. The lab report's final note read, "Findings consistent with at least 3 consecutive generations of direct sibling unions." For Holloway, the evidence reframed everything. This wasn't just neglect or even abuse, it was the institutionalization of incest as a survival strategy. The cellar wasn't a prison in their minds, it was a nursery, a classroom, a holding pen to ensure the purity of the next generation. One of the last discoveries came not from the house, but from the county archives. A junior clerk, intrigued by the unfolding investigation, dug into mislabeled storage boxes and found the missing 1974 report by Margaret Doyle. Scrawled in red ink across the top, "Destroy after review," at the bottom. Doyle's final recommendation: immediate removal of all minors from premises. Bloodline is closed to a degree that poses extreme health risk. That warning had been ignored. Nearly 30 years later, Mercer and Holloway were staring at the living proof of what ignoring it had cost. And yet, there was still one question unanswered: who had made the anonymous call that finally brought them to the Johnson property, and why now? After decades of silence, the answer to the question of who had called didn't come immediately. The investigation wound its way through interviews with distant relatives, county workers from decades past, and the handful of neighbors still living within a mile of the Johnson land. Most claimed ignorance, some genuinely had no idea what went on there. Others preferred not to admit they had known and done nothing. It was an elderly woman named Ruth Caldwell who finally broke the silence. She lived alone on the property nearest the Johnsons and had for over 50 years. Her voice shook as she told Holloway and Mercer about a winter night 2 months earlier. "I saw a light moving in the trees behind my house," she said. "Figured it was a hunter. But when I went out, I saw him, the tall one. He didn't say anything, just stood there until I asked if he was lost. Then he shook his head and walked back toward the Johnson place. That's when I knew something was wrong. They've never come off that land, not once." Caldwell waited weeks before calling, wrestling with whether she should interfere after so many years, but I thought, if I don't, it's going to keep going, and they'll just disappear out there like the rest of them. The case against the surviving relatives, those who had left the land years earlier but were found complicit in arranging the pairings, was built slowly. 2 cousins living in another county were charged with obstruction after it was proven they had hidden birth records. One elderly aunt faced charges of child endangerment for acting as midwife and recording births only in the family Bible. For the Johnson brothers, the legal path was different. Psychological evaluations concluded they were incapable of independent living. Their understanding of the world so shaped by isolation that concepts like town, neighbors, and marriage outside the family were met with blank stares. The court declared them wards of the state. They were placed together in a long-term care facility nearly 200 miles away, in a small room with twin beds and a single window overlooking a garden. When journalists descended on Willow Creek, they found a community reluctant to speak. The Johnson property, still in probate, stood empty. Snow drifted through the gaps in the barn's roof. Wind rattled the nailed-shut windows of the farmhouse. Developers expressed interest in buying the land, but no one in town wanted to see houses built there. "It's cursed," one store clerk told a reporter. "Not ghosts, just the memory of what people are willing to ignore." The rediscovered 1974 report became a lightning rod in state politics. Lawmakers questioned how such a document could vanish without accountability. Advocacy groups used it to push for stronger oversight of rural homeschooling and mandatory health checks for children in isolated areas. But once the headlines faded, so did much of the outrage. Years later, a new family moved into a renovated home on the edge of Willow Creek. The children rode their bikes past the abandoned Johnson property without knowing its history. But for those who had lived there long enough, the silence from that patch of land still felt heavy. Ruth Caldwell said she never walked near the fence line anymore, even in daylight. Some places, she told Holloway during a follow-up visit, keep their secrets in the dirt. The origin of those secrets, the belief that purity could be preserved by closing the bloodline, had outlived the people who enforced it. It lingered in the photographs, the ledgers, and the quiet way the brothers still sat side by side, decades later, as if afraid the world might separate them. The Johnson case became a footnote in state history books. a cautionary tale buried between chapters on rural settlement and public health reform. But for Mercer, Holloway, and the handful of others who had walked through that house, it was not a story of history. It was a story of inheritance, not of land or wealth, but of silence, and the damage silence can do when it is passed down, unquestioned, from one generation to the next. And so, the question falls to those who hear it now, when secrecy is called tradition, and tradition is used to justify harm. How long before the harm becomes invisible, and once invisible, who will be left to name it?